Welcome back to part 3 of our series where we are talking about Azure functions and basically how to get an HTTP trigger-based Azure function set up using Python. In our previous video, we talked a little bit about Azure functions, a little bit more, but it was mainly focused on actually getting a project set up inside of Visual Studio Code, along with covering the extensions that you might want to have installed when you start using this particular type of service. And then additionally, I did want to spend some time going over the files. Now, I know the files weren't necessarily the most exciting topic on the planet. However, there's really important information inside of those files, and it's also really important to know how things can break because a lot of the times we're not spending our time working with code that's working, we're working with code that's not working. And so we want to make sure what potentially could be causing our code not to be working. And a very big thing inside of Azure Functions is we have to make sure our files are set up a very particular way. So if you did skip video number 2, it's going to be one of those videos. I'm going to highly encourage you to go watch it because otherwise you could potentially put yourself into a bind and you'll be lost. Okay, so let's start writing our function. We're going to have to import some libraries, so bear with me. So you can't print. You can't print out things to the terminal. You can log things, and then when you run your Azure function, you'll be able to see the results of that logging. So it's very important that you do have logging imported because otherwise you might not be able to see stuff. And then we're going to import some other stuff. So we're going to import JSON. We have to make sure that we send back things as JSON. So very important that we do that. Visual Studio Code, man, it's starting to weird out on me. Time, we're going to have to pause at a certain point in our code. PYODBC, we're going to be connecting to a SQL database hosted on Azure. So we're going to be using the PYODBC library in order to do that. Date time, we're going to have to convert some of our date time objects to strings. And so this will help us do that. We're going to do it using a function. So that way when we dump our JSON, we're not going to have any serialization errors. This is fine. So logging's fine. Azure functions, you obviously need this one. And then finally, I will have a config file that does have some sensitive information inside of it. So I'll be putting that inside of there. And then we will go through that. Now, I don't know what it is, but Visual Studio Code tends to not work with IntelliSense all of a sudden. I updated to Python 3.9, and ever since then, my IntelliSense has been all over the place. So bear with me as I might have to reload my windows sometimes just to make sure things are happening the right way. I mentioned this in the previous video. You'll very likely get something like this, which is basically saying, hey, you need to update. You would just update it. You might get prompted again. If you've already updated it, you don't need to update it again. Just keep in mind, it seems to be a little bit of a bug and it just keeps prompting you and prompting you and prompting you even when you've installed it. So don't be surprised if you see that. As long as it's working, that's the important part. Okay. Next thing is, like I said in the previous one, we want to make sure that we have PYODBC in our requirements.txt file, because right now you can see we are getting an import error, which is expected. And that's because PYODBC is not installed in what? Not my local system, in my virtual environment. I should see it inside of here. If I don't see it inside of here, it means I can't leverage it inside of my function. So I have to make sure I install it first. Otherwise, I can't use it in my function. So different ways you can do it. You could wait until you run the particular function, or if you're like me and you're impatient, you can just install it right now. You would open up your terminal and then you would do pip install -r and then point to your requirements.txt file. Now, more than likely, you are not going to have an up-to-date version of pip. So if you want, you can update it. It's, again, not a requirement, but I like to keep things up to date, so I tend to do it. So I'm going to do pip install upgrade pip. What did I do? Oh, I did it in quotes. I don't need it in quotes. So pip install upgrade pip. And it's usually pretty quick. Apparently that time it didn't want to. Oh, it's because I did. Oh, sorry. My apologies. Pip install upgrade pip. There we go. Okay. Fourth time's the charm, right? So it's uninstalling it, and then it's going to install it. And then additionally, if you go in here, I should now see my PYODBC package. So if I see it there, it's good. This will probably not update right away. So you just have to, again, reload the window. So Shift Control P, developer reload window. And then wait for it to load again. And then I will have a config file, like I said. So I'm going to actually copy that one over. So bear with me. I'm going to do reveal in File Explorer. I'm going to go in here. I'm going to copy this one. This I've covered config files in many, many videos, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this. It's just a place where I can store my credentials in a secure, well, not necessarily secure. It's just in a location where other people can't see it when I'm recording. So all this is doing is I'm just putting it in there, and I break it into sections, and then I'm going to add in two different things. One of those is for my username, and then the next one is for my password. Okay. So the first function that I'm actually going to create is going to be called default. This is actually handling the JSON serialization. So we will be getting back dates and date times from my database. We need to make sure that they're strings. And so we can create a function that we then pass through to our JSON.dumps method. And what that will do is anytime it encounters this particular object, being a date or a date time, it will convert it to an ISO formatted string. So it has to be a string. I don't want it as a, as a date time object. I want it as a string. So we're going to say if is instance, and we're going to say object, and then this, if it's either one of these, datetime.datetime, comma, datetime.date. So if it's either a date or a date time, what do you want to have happen? I want you to return that object, but I want you to do one very important thing, which is convert it to an ISO formatted string. So I just need a string. This function will help me do that. Okay, then from here, let's start going into our main function. This is again where we write the bulk of our code that we want to have execute every time we run our function. So here, this is just logging us to let us know that, hey, our function is running. In some cases, you're going to be passing through parameters. So for example, I might have one parameter that would be something like the table name, right? So you might say, hey, give me a table name. If you give me a table name, I'll give you the first 100 rows in that table. We'll keep it simple at this point. So with this, we can basically grab those parameters, store them in a variable, and then potentially use them at different points in our script. So the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna grab the table name parameter. Okay, so I'm gonna create a new variable. I'll call it table name. And then I'm gonna go into my request, and then I'm gonna do get, or sorry, not get, params. And then I'm gonna do get, and then I need to put in the name of my parameter. So in this case, it's gonna be table name, lowercase with an underscore. So I'm gonna change this just to make sure I'm consistent. Now I can do something where if I don't get it, I could do like a default value. So I could do DT underscore IDX, and then I'll do XBRL. So I actually have a database inside of Microsoft Azure that has multiple tables that contain basically all the IDX files parsed. And so I structure them based on the content inside of them. So I have a table that contains just XBRL filings. I will try to get it up relatively quick. Sometimes it takes a little bit to connect to it. So if it starts giving me headaches, I might just skip it in in the data Visual Studio component. Okay, I'm gonna zoom in a little bit, go into my database. This is where things tend to glitch on me a little bit. I wish they could figure out these connection issues because, once you're connected, it's fine. It's getting connected that can, for whatever reason, be the issue. So sometimes I will just do it again. I find it works a little bit better if I just connect through the actual script itself. And so then if I open this, I will refresh it. I will refresh it. Well, let's do this. I will do select. Let me connect to it again so you can see it. I want to try to show you the data because otherwise I'm going to feel bad if I don't. So we'll do select top. There's a lot in there, by the way, and then we'll do the SCC filing once it connects. SCC filings. Yeah, I know. Every time there seems to be an issue, you freak out. And then we'll do the, IDX, data table, IDX, XBRL. So this should return the top 100 rows. As it's thinking, as it's thinking, as it's thinking. At some point, I'm probably just going to have to upgrade the memory or something on this because it's getting kind of ridiculous how it just seems to never want to connect. Okay, well, that's going in the background. So we're going to grab our table name parameter. Once we have that table name, we would ideally put it into a query. Oh, don't want to delete it. So from here, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to read my config file. So I'm going to initialize my config parser. So I'm going to say config parser equals, and then I'm going to do the config parser object. I will read the file, the config file. I will just get rid of all of this. Read the config file. So we're going to do config parser, and then we'll do the read method, and then I need to point to the file path. Now, here is something important. Do not provide the full file path. Provide the relative file path. So relative to this little folder right here. So it can be anywhere in there. You can have folder after folder after folder, but you need to have this as your starting point because otherwise it's actually going to be a little bit different based on where it's hosted in the server. I'm going to check this really quickly. This seems to be doing great. Yeah. Okay, well, we'll have that go again. Okay, so once I've done that, I need to load the credentials. So I'm gonna create a new variable, call it database username. I'm gonna do config parser, and then I'm gonna do get. I'm gonna provide the section. In this case, I have an SEC database section, and then it's gonna be stored in the variable called database username. Super creative, I know. And then I'll put my password in here, password, and then my password. And also kind of as like a little bit of a reference, personally, I probably wouldn't do it as a config file. I'm only doing it just because it's relatively easy. I would probably be using Microsoft Key Vault. I've used that in Azure Functions before. I think that's a little bit more secure. That's just my personal opinion. Again, I'm not saying you can't technically do this, but that's how I would do it. However, I know some people, they don't want to pay for the extra service. So again, it's kind of just a trade-off. I'll probably show it again in the timer one just to kind of add some variety and if you wanted to see it done different ways. But just keep that in mind. Okay, so we've now read the credentials. So I'll put a little note in here just saying like logging info. Read credentials, something like that. Then from here, I do also want to kind of just print out another thing, which is grab the drivers. well, actually I'll say print out the drivers. So this is actually going to be leveraging PYODBC now. Now, the only reason I do this is because we'll have to see it inside of Azure, unfortunately, but I want to show you that when it comes to drivers, we have to use a very specific one. You don't have an option, so you have to use this one. And that's the ODBC driver 17 for SQL Server. So I'm going to define the driver. So I'm going to call it driver equals, in quotes, curly brackets, ODBC driver 17 for SQL Server. It has to look exactly like this. You cannot use 13. You have to use 17. You cannot use, I don't think you can use the SQL Server native client driver either. This one's actually hosted on the Linux server. So just, again, keep that in mind. If you are planning to use PYODBC inside of your Azure function, you need to make sure that you use the ODBC driver 17 for SQL Server at the time of this recording. I'm not going to promise it's not going to change over time, but at the time of this recording, you got to use this one. So if you do run into issues, just type it in online and then probably go to your first few Stack Overflow articles, and it's going to be right there. Okay. Then from here, I'm going to define my connection string. So the connection string is what we're going to be using to actually connect to our database. And right here, you know what I'm doing? I'm going to close this out because this is driving me crazy. Let's try again. It just doesn't like it. Oh, did it go? Did it go? My God. It did go. Oh, it never goes. So, well, I get this. I'm sorry, this is so exciting. Usually it doesn't run. Okay, so basically I have a table inside of my SQL database SEC filings, and it has just a massive table of XBRL filings that is on the SEC. It's like 10 gigs worth of URLs. It's insane. But yeah, so this is basically what we're going to be doing. So we need to define the connection string in order to connect to that database, obviously. So I'm going to create a new variable, call it connection string. Connection strings can get very finicky when you start adding indents that you weren't supposed to and all sorts of other stuff. So I use the text wrapped module to basically help clean up my connection string. So I don't think I imported it, which is kind of surprising. So I'm going to import text wrap. It's a default one, so you don't have to worry about it. Put that there. I'm picky, so I put it like that. And then I'm going to put this and like that. Okay. So this will just make it where the connection string is a little bit cleaner. So I'm going to do driver equals, do a little placeholder, and then I'll have it have a name called driver server. So this is the server you need to connect to. So you can get this information from many different places. So you could get it from here. You could say property wizards. You got to be a little bit careful when you use it inside of this because it tends to, again, sometimes freak out because it's not, understanding things correctly, I guess. I don't know exactly how to say it, but you just have to be really careful when you go through it like this because sometimes it will freak out and say like, oh, you're trying to, access something that you can't. So you can see it down here as well. So you could get it from here, Sigma Coding, SEC database, Windows. You need to make sure that you can actually connect to it. So sometimes if you don't have your firewall set up correctly, I've seen that cause issues before. If you don't have the right IP address, that can cause issues. So, there's just lots of things that unfortunately can go wrong. But in this case, it's sigma-coding-sec.database.windows.net. And then I'm going to also provide the port by separating it with a comma. And then I'm going to do 1433 semicolon. Then we're going to do the database that we want to connect to. So in this case, it's SEC filings. This one is fine. User ID, so UID, this is going to have a placeholder for the username. Same with the password. This one's going to have a placeholder with the variable password. Encrypt, this one they always had on there. I've had it on and off before, and I haven't had any issues. I just tend to leave it on. And then trust server certificates. This one you can have to know, unless you've set it differently, then it's different. And then connection timeout. So this one defines how long before it times out with the connection. I think the default is 15 seconds, but I've had things where it doesn't connect right away. So I bump it up to 30 seconds, but don't take my word on 15 seconds. I'm not positive that's the one. And then I need to place in my variables. So in this case, I have a driver I need to fill out. So we'll do driver username equals the database, not password, username. And then we have the password, and that's going to be the database password. Additionally, something you need to be a little bit careful about is when you do these little placeholders, or if you were to read it from a config file like I am, sometimes there's a little extra quotation marks there that you don't need. So if you pass those through, then unfortunately what happens is the connection string is not correctly formatted, so you get an error. So I like to replace those single quotation marks if they're there. So just be aware of that. I've had that be an issue before, so you don't want to run into that one. So that's your connection string, all glamorous. From here, we need to create a new connection. And from this one, we'll say try, and then I'll create a new variable called connection. It's going to be a PYODBC connection object. So I'm doing type hinting right there. I'm going to do PYODBC connect, and then I'm going to pass through my connection string. Now, sometimes I've had it happen in the past. It doesn't connect the first time. So if it needs a little extra time, just do accept, and then you can do time, sleep, 2 seconds, and then you basically do the same exact thing again. So that's all that's doing. I only had it happen on my first SQL server. I think part of it can be sometimes the region you're doing. So, if your region's far away, that could be a bit of a problem. But that was the only time I ever ran into that issue. It was like a server that was, I think, on like the East Coast or something like that. And for whatever reason, it took forever. But generally speaking, if I did it like in where I'm living, so I'm on the West Coast. So if I do a server on the West Coast, didn't seem to have an issue then. That, and I pay for the cheapest one. So you get what you pay for, unfortunately. And then from here, we're going to define the new query. So this is going to be the query that we're actually going to be executing. So we will call this our select query. I'll do it in triple quotes, and then I'm going to do triple quotes, and I'm going to do select top 100 stars, so all columns from, and then I'm going to do DBO, and then I'm going to do the table name, so the table name. So with this one, if I didn't pass through anything, it would use this default one for me. And then just like the previous one, I need to make sure I format it. So I'm going to do format, and then I'm going to do the table name equals the table name. So that's just making sure that it populates this one. And then I'll put a little thing here as well, say log the connection. So I'll just say logging info connection to database established, something like that. It's just something that I can know that it's connected. You'd be surprised, trust me. Having these little logging things helps tremendously. Let's execute the query. So we're going to say cursor object. I need to create the cursor first. I don't have it. So create the cursor. So I'm going to call this cursor object colon PYODBC. It's a cursor object. I'm going to take that connection, and I'm going to call that cursor method that returns the cursor object. And then I'm going to do the execute method. So I'm going to execute my select query. So if that query was successfully executed, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to clean up my records a little bit, and I'm going to make sure that they are properly formatted. So sometimes what I'll do is I'll do this. So I'll execute the query and then fetch all the records. So I'm going to create a new variable, call it records. I'm going to wrap it in the list function. I'm going to call my cursor object, and there's a fetch all method that returns all the results from that query. We have to be a little bit careful though, because technically it's a list of row objects, and unless you add something up here to handle that, then when you try to dump it in the JSON, it's not going to work correctly. So I just do list comprehension to convert each of those row objects to a tuple. Again, different ways to do it. This is just demonstrating a different way. Not that, oops. Clean up the record set. So I'm going to call this records equals, using list comprehension, tuple record for each, for record in records. So for each record in my record set, convert each record to a tuple. That's all it's doing. Okay. And then, oh, more news. For those of you who are not in the US, it's been a fun couple weeks with the election. log the query. So I'm not going to print out everything, but if you wanted to see like maybe just one record, for example, you could do like record, and then one, something like that. Different ways. You could even, I probably would wrap it in a string, to be completely honest, because I don't trust that it's going to handle it correctly. So depending on what happens. Okay, so there's that. And then from here, you actually have enough to return it back to the user. So you could do return, and then it would be func HTTP response. You have your body. The body is the actual JSON content. So I'm going to call it JSON dumps. The object is that record set. I'll have it indented for, and then I'll have the default. So this is handling those date times. Remember that there's technically dates and date times in my record set. So anytime it encounters one of those, this default function is going to convert it to a string. You can see it. So if that object that I'm dealing with is a date time or a date, convert it to an ISO formatted string. Very important. And then you can also give it a status code of 200. And with that, let's test it out. Woo. So to test out your function locally, very easy. You just go over to your little debug pane, and then you're going to do attach to Python. It's going to go through and it's going to install your requirements file first, and then it's going to show you this. So give it a second. You need to wait just a little bit longer. When you see worker process started and initialized, you can navigate to the URL. It's very common to get errors your first couple times because you probably didn't do something right. Don't beat yourself up over it. But in this situation, because I've written it before, I already ran into those errors, so it was successful. So I can now see the result of my call to this URL. Now, keep in mind, I didn't provide anything with this. So if I wanted to, I could also put the table name parameter in there as well. So I could say table name equals, and then I'll put, I don't know, this little DTIDX RBL, that one again. Or what's some other ones I have? We'll do the form one. We'll do form. Oh, doesn't need to be in a string. You can just have it just like that. And then if I put this here, hopefully it doesn't break. I haven't technically tried that one, but you can still see it still worked just fine. And it's also definitely some different filings as well. So you can see these are very different filings. So it did come from different ones. And then if you maybe wanted to, you could navigate to this filing and you can see all the content inside of it and all that kind of fun stuff. So I am actually working on an API for the SEC. So it's coming along nicely. The goal is to give it to those in the Patreon first. So I'm going to try to do something like, I don't know, like 1,000 calls a month or something like that. I'll figure it out. And then I'll have like a pay as you go one as you want. So if you want to only do it for one query, do it for one query. And then also, just so you can see it, you can also see your drivers, right? So I was printing out the drivers. I was doing that on purpose because I want you to see it. This is my local drivers, local. So I can see that record sets, all sorts of fun stuff. So at this point, we've validated that it worked. That's awesome. Let's move on to the next step, which is actually making it where it's hosted on Microsoft Azure. So I'm going to click this little disconnect button. Now, for some of you, this happens to me all the time. When you click that little disconnect button, something happens in Visual Studio Code and it freezes. You can either close it down or you can wait till it says reload window. So don't be surprised if that happens either. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my Azure pane. Right now I can see my local project. I can see everything here. You notice I can execute function now, copy function URL, add binding. So I can even customize it a little bit more if I wanted to. But in this situation, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to deploy to function app. So you see this little blue arrow. I'm going to click that. Then I'm going to be asked, where do you want to put it? Where do you want to put this new thing? In this situation, I can do a couple different things. I can put it into an existing one, or in this situation, I can create a new one. I'm going to create a new one. I'm going to call it Sigma function app. And then I'll do test, right? It does ask you for a runtime stack. I just keep the same one that I was using before. So Python 3.8. And then now you got to choose your resource location. So I'm in the US on the West Coast. So I just click West US, but you can obviously see if you're in Korea, if you're in Southeast Asia, Switzerland, that's very specific, Australia. And then it's going to create a storage account. This does take a few minutes, so be patient, be very patient. There's a lot that's happening behind the scenes. If you do want to see what's happening behind the scenes, just go to your output and then do Azure Functions, and you can see all this stuff here. Now, because I had to create a new storage account, it's going to take a little bit longer compared to if I had just done the function itself. So keep that in mind. If you're creating more resources, what's going to happen? It's going to take a little bit longer. So just be patient with that. That's also assuming everything was set up correctly with your subscription, FYI. And that you're in the right account, FYI. And you can see, but it's really nice. I mean, I like these functions. It's nice where I can work with databases and stuff like that. So I think it's great, and it's been really nice. I'm going to also show you what it looks like inside of Azure Portal, because that's what we do here is we go through Azure Portal. If I wanted to, I could refresh. Once it actually logs me in. It's probably not showing right now just because it's still technically going in, so be patient. And then I can go to function app. You can see that that new one was finally created. If I go back to Visual Studio Code, it's still running, but at least I can start seeing it on Azure Portal. But you notice a lot of this is just kind of running through stuff we've already done before. So I'm going to go to my app test. There's a lot of good information here. My URL, very important. I can see access control. So if I want other people to have access to it, I can see my actual functions. So you can have multiple functions inside of here. Keep that in mind as well, as I'm like jumping around. Okay, deployment, no HP, okay, perfect. View output. So now if I open up this one, I now have it under here. You can actually see your files, you can see your application settings, you can see your functions, all sorts of different stuff. And then from here, it's kind of odd. It doesn't look like don't tell me it didn't load the function. Goodness. Do not tell me it didn't load the function. No. Hold on. We're going to see what happens. Of course, it didn't work this time. It never wants to work. Oh, there it is. Okay, so it was there. I thought it wasn't there. So now if I go here, I can see my actual function itself. There's also some really nice tools in here as well. So it does give you a nice little visual way of seeing just successful executions, failed executions. You can actually test out your code if you wanted to. So you could even do things like see the code. You can't edit the code here, at least for Linux. So Linux you can't. You can get your function URL. You can test and run it. You can do all sorts of different stuff. So you can mimic a GET request. You can do all sorts of different stuff. So you can play around with it. I encourage you, if you get a chance, try it out and see what happens. So if I wanted to try it out and just, I don't know, we'll just say master host key. We'll see what happens. Beautiful. So it looks like it worked gorgeous. So that's always a good sign. I wish there was more logging, but we'll see what happens. Sometimes you have to refresh it a little bit. I've noticed, especially with the logging, it doesn't come back right away. So don't freak out if you don't see anything. These are great services, but I can definitely tell Microsoft, I think, is in early stages with some of these. Let's try running it again and see what happens. You might not see it here. If you don't, then I'll show you some other places you can see it. So you can see it in the monitor section as well. Keep in mind, this is 5 minutes delayed. So you would be able to see it here. You can also go to your log files as well. I'll go back here and see if anything happens. So it tends to keep a relatively, I guess it didn't that time. And then if you wanted to, you could also get the function URL as well. So you can see it does log it as time goes on. So just be patient. Don't freak out if, things don't change right away, especially depending on the service you have. It does take a few minutes to sometimes see the results. But you can see, even when I'm going to my non-localhost one, everything seems to be working exactly the same. Oh, perfect. So you could see it. So I did want to highlight one little thing here. I'm going to zoom in as much as I can. Oh, goodness. Which driver is that? ODBC driver 17 for SQL Server. That is the only driver you get access to. So it has to be that one. Very important you recognize that, because otherwise it ain't going to work. And then you're going to go, why is it not working? It's because you probably don't have the right driver set up. So be very, very aware of that. Otherwise, you could be spinning your wheels for a very, very long time. Okay, so just one final thing. If you wanted to delete this function after doing it, I already have functions on there, so I don't need this one anymore. I can right click and I can actually delete that function app as well. I can also, just to highlight some stuff, I'm going to refresh this again. Okay, and so now I can see it again. I can also copy the URL from here. You can see the logs. You can see all sorts of different stuff. I don't need to go in that much detail. There's slots. I haven't used slots before. But yeah, so there's files you can see in here as well. In this situation, I'm actually just going to delete the function app. And then if you get this little prompt, this is just telling you that, hey, like, you basically created your own storage account for just that function. So if you delete the function, do you still want to keep the app service plan? In this situation, I don't. So I can delete that as well. That's because I only had that app service plan for specifically that function. So be very careful though when you delete that. Whew, I think that's it. Cool. All right. So what's next? So next video, we're going to be doing something similar, but instead of doing an HTTP trigger, we're going to be doing a timer trigger. And then I will also show you to kind of give you some highlights on how you can test it a little bit. I would say sometimes the easiest thing to do is to do the HTTP trigger and then just convert it to a timer trigger. Then it's usually a little bit easier as well. So we'll talk about that. We'll also talk about having multiple files, part of your kind of structure, just if you want to see that. And then we'll also, I think, talk about, what else were we going to talk about? I can't remember. I'll think of it when I get there. But oh yeah, Key Vault. We'll talk about Key Vault too. So yeah. I mean, if you have any questions, feel free to put them down in the comments below. Also, if you are new to the channel and if you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing to Sigma Coding. And then if you want to get notifications when I upload videos, which can sometimes be very many at a time, make sure to turn on your little bell notification so that way you can get that as well. And then other than that, thank you again for watching, everybody. We'll see you in the next video.